Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. So when we think about the origins of democratic government and, the whole concept of liberty, our minds usually drift toward these grand philosophers in marble halls, or maybe some dramatic, bloody revolutions. But actually, the truth is a lot grittier. The real story of modern democracy didn't come from lofty theories. It was literally hammered out in the muddy, bustling streets of 15th century English towns. Today, we're going to see exactly how ordinary people, just living their daily lives, forged the very systems of self-governance that we rely on right now.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the workshops of freedom, then move on to breaking the feudal chains and the heavy price of liberty. After that, we'll look at town versus church and wrap things up with the birth of the commons.
Okay, Section 1. The Workshops of Freedom, Political Laboratories.
Let's dive right into this. The historian Alice Stopford Green actually hits the nail on the head here. She wrote, "There were the workshops in which the political creed of England was fashioned." And that is absolutely crucial. It wasn't happening in the royal courts. It was in the isolated, completely self-governing life of a 15th century borough that the idea of a free commonwealth was actually born. Out of the, frankly, squalor of the early Middle Ages, these small towns just started accumulating wealth. And more importantly, they started drawing up these incredibly elaborate, highly artificial constitutions. They were experimenting. They were tinkering with representation and administration with this relentless ingenuity that ended up completely transforming the political landscape. It was like a giant political laboratory.
Now take a look at the stark contrast between the English boroughs and the French communes. It's wild. In France, the fight for liberty was super dramatic, born in war, and honestly, incredibly short-lived. Between 1130 and 1330, they rose up, went bankrupt, and were just utterly crushed by feudalism. But over in England, it was a story of just boring, monotonous obscurity. But here's the thing. That obscurity was literally their superpower. For 300 years, English towns enjoyed unbroken prosperity. They just peacefully purchased their freedom while nobody was looking, totally shielded from the devastating wars sweeping across the continent. So how did these humble little English towns actually pull this off? How did they shake off the absolute rule of the feudal lords who owned their land and dictated every single trade they made?
Let's get into Section 2, Breaking the Feudal Chains, Buying Independence.
Well, the answer to how they broke those chains is remarkably practical. They didn't usually fight bloody revolutions. Instead, they literally just bought their freedom. The burghers capitalized on the growing poverty and bankruptcy of the noble class, because, as it turns out, cash-strapped lords make for very agreeable negotiators. They took all these vexatious feudal obligations, things like arbitrary tolls and mandatory military service, and they commuted them into fixed yearly rent payments. Basically, they leased out their rights of trade, they started collecting their own tolls, and they negotiated their way right out of serfdom. A bargain was struck, cash changed hands, and step by step, these serfs transformed into free citizens answering to nobody but themselves.
And you can see the sheer scale of this transformation perfectly when you look at the town of Bridport. In 1319, this place was dealing with extreme poverty. There were only 67 taxpayers. Their entire military armament, pitchforks, staves, and some knives. The richest guy in town was worth just £4 and 8 shillings. To put that into perspective, his entire wealth was basically 1 cow and 2 hogs. But then jump forward to 1458, and it is a completely different world. We're talking a vast increase in population, guys marching around in actual plate armor with bows and guns, prosperous fraternities springing up, and the funding of brand new public works like causeways. This was literally the Industrial Revolution of the 15th century, taking a town from staggering poverty to formidable middle-class wealth and real military might. But as these towns got richer and more independent, they were about to realize something. Freedom? It was a grueling chore.
Which brings us to Section 3, the heavy price of liberty, self-sufficient survival.
Okay, imagine living in a 15th century borough. Your civic duties were intense. You couldn't rely on the state for anything. Nothing. You had to be completely self-sufficient. Every free burgher was expected to perform night watch and ward patrols just to keep the peace. You had to physically walk the bounds to defend the town borders from rival lords. You were called on to audit the town chest, manage the taxes, and yes, you literally had to do hard manual labor, like digging moats and repairing the actual city walls. The entire survival of the community rested squarely on the shoulders of every single person living there.
And because the stakes were so high, the municipality was an incredibly stern creditor. If you tried to dodge those civic duties, or if you skimped on paying your share of the town rent, the punishment was swift and, honestly, kind of shocking. The authorities would literally march over to your house, take the doors and windows completely off their hinges, and leave the building totally open to the elements and empty for a year and a day. I mean, talk about a brutal open concept floor plan, right? You were completely exposed until you finally paid up and made things right with the community. This whole idea of intense collective responsibility brings us to a fascinating concept called walking the bounds. This was a yearly perambulation, basically a big march by the mayor and citizens to inspect landmarks and aggressively, sometimes violently, assert their town limits against rival lords. And to make absolutely sure the next generation never forgot those borders, they used some pretty clever tricks. In Canterbury, for instance, the mayor would actually hand out copper coins to the children at specific landmarks during the walk. The idea was that these kids would forever remember the exact limits of the town's franchise because, well, that's where they got free money. It was very hands-on civic education. But even with all this strict internal discipline, these towns still face some massive external threats.
Let's move to Section 4, Town versus Church, the ultimate threat.
You see, dealing with a lay lord, like a secular noble, that was one thing. They were often absent, sometimes bankrupt, and as we just saw, pretty easily bought off. But the ecclesiastical lords, the abbots and the bishops, completely different story. They possessed massive wealth, immense spiritual and temporal power, and they ruled with absolute authority. For towns completely controlled by cathedrals and abbeys, places like Winchester or Lynn, they faced a hopeless and devastating battle for independence. The church simply didn't need the town's money the way some bankrupt noble did, which made them nearly impossible to negotiate with.
Let's look at a specific little narrative that perfectly captures this struggle: the town of Reading's rebellion. The townspeople there were just desperate for self-governance. So, step 1, they sneakily used their merchant guild as a secret hub for political organizing. Step 2, the abbot, obviously seeing what was going on, flat out refused to appoint a mayor, trying to completely stifle their independence. By step 3, in 1493, the burghers had just had enough. They openly rebelled and elected their own mayor anyway, boldly asserting their authority. But then, step 4, the abbot just used his immense resources and crushed the rebellion in the king's court. The towns tried every sneaky trick in the book to usurp power, but against the sheer might of the church, they often failed. However, despite setbacks in specific towns like Reading, the overall movement happening across England, it was completely unstoppable.
And that brings us to Section 5, the birth of the Commons, a tectonic shift. Take a good look at this number, 226. I know it might not look like much on its own, but this number actually represents a massive, tectonic shift in power that the middle class achieved in national politics by the end of the Middle Ages.
By the 15th century, 226 burghers and shopkeepers were sitting in Parliament. Now, compare that to just 74 knights of the Shire who represented the traditional landed nobility. The burghers vastly outnumbered them, no contest. The wealth, the organizational genius, and frankly, just the sheer administrative competence of these independent towns turned them into the new arbiters of English politics. Kings couldn't just rely on the nobles anymore. They were practically forced to court the favor of the towns. The very foundations of the House of Commons, and really modern democratic representation itself, were built by these very merchants and craftsmen.
Which leaves us with a final, pretty vital question to ponder. If the true foundations of our democracy and our liberty were built by 15th century shopkeepers demanding local control, literally paying for it out of their own pockets, and personally digging the moats to defend it, what are we doing to maintain that legacy today? Liberty has always come with a heavy price, and it's always demanded constant, active participation. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this changes how you view the incredible, muddy, hard-fought story of democracy. See you next time.